Our next session is Tasting the Roast Curve, Finding Our Way to the Perfect Profile. I'd like to thank our session sponsor, Pacific Foods, and I'm super happy to introduce Nicki Amouri. Nicki is a licensed Arabica Q grader, Specialty Coffee Association certified roaster, SCAA certified barista, and an authorized SCA trainer. She currently is the roast master for Cafe Amouri. She's a green bean buyer and a roasting instructor for Cafe Amouri in Vienna, Virginia. Nicki designs and teaches roasting courses at the Cafe Amouri Experiences SCA Certified Premier Lab, advises wholesale customers regarding their coffee operations, and supervises the roasting team. Nicki has worked on Cafe Amouri's Diedrich IR12 since 2014, roasting, developing profiles, creating automated profiles for editing manual roasts, and maintaining, cleaning, and troubleshooting problems. She's been a consultant for other roasters on a number of issues, including improving roast profiles, training roasting staff, and roaster maintenance. Nicki has a Bachelor's of Science in Religious Studies and American Culture from Randolph-Macon Women's College and a Master of Divinity degree from the Union Theological Seminary. I'm pretty sure that's going to need some more description later, Nicki. I want to know more about those degrees. It sounds very interesting. Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great, Connie. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, and thank you, Trish and Rob, for your awesome presentations this morning. I learned a lot.
100%.
Hey, everybody. It's really great to be here at this year's Roast Summit. I have a lot of information I want to cover, so I'm just going to start. All right. So here's our topic for today, tasting the roast curve, finding our way to the perfect profile. As you heard from my bio, I'm Nicki and I'm a roaster. Roasting is my main thing. I've been deep in the weeds with roasting for about 8 to 9 years now. You all know the weeds I'm talking about. Trying out profiles, taking 2, 3, or 4 tries to hit the goals you're aiming for, deciding I've got it or I've nailed it, then realizing it could be better, and constantly feeling like you're starting over from scratch. Sometimes you get a profile you like and you aren't entirely sure why, or you do know why, but then you go to replicate it and it comes out different. Back to square one. One thing is for certain, and that is that roasting is very humbling. So no pressure, but as roasters, we have this immense challenge to create the best tasting coffee possible. We need to find that perfect profile, and we work to find that perfect profile. When we all talk about our perfect or ideal profile, what sort of information or data are we including? Is it a couple data points or many data points? Do you say something like, always make sure you have a declining rate of rise, or make sure you have a certain development time ratio? Maybe you just reference drying time, yellow in 5 to 6 minutes, or Mayard time, hit first crack in 8 to 9 minutes. Or maybe you're including all 3, drying time plus Mayard time plus development time. For those of you who are familiar with SCA sample roasting guidelines or spec, the standard profile that is given for roasting green samples is yellow at 3 minutes, first crack at 7 minutes, and finish in 8 to 10 minutes, not going over 12 minutes. My guess is we all say different things when talking about our ideal profile, and that is the beauty of coffee roasting. But it can be a lot of information to process and figure out which works best for you. So the most important question of all might be, can our minds not explode as we try to wrap our heads around all of the possibilities and factors that go into making a profile? I think the answer is no. My mind has exploded on a number of occasions. I'm hoping today I could keep your mind from exploding, either by affirming something you already know, which will then encourage you on your path, or by showing you a path which has been my path of profile development that you can yourselves replicate. Our ultimate goal is to get at the question that every roaster wants to know and ultimately tries to master, which is, how does a particular change I make to the roast affect the way the coffee tastes? Another way to put this, and maybe more to the truth, when something unexpected happens to our roast, like we open a new bag of beans with a lower moisture content, and the beans turn around way lower than before, or our assistant roaster forgets a fuel change, and now Mayard is a whole minute shorter. If any of these unforeseen things happen to our coffee and our profile, what can we expect taste-wise? As the title of this presentation suggests, we are going to, quote, taste the segments of the roast curve. I have taste in quotation marks because unfortunately, we cannot physically be together to taste the profiles. But hopefully it will be as close to sharing the experience of tasting with you as possible. I will share my experiments with you in terms of three main sections: shorter versus longer Mayard, shorter versus longer development, and shorter versus longer drying. In each section, we'll discuss what variable was changed and which variables were kept constant to create three different profiles, the technical moves of how to roast each profile, and the tasting results, which will lead us to say, by making this one change, like extending my development time, I can expect to taste blank. I want to answer two questions that might be on your mind before we get to the good stuff. The first question is, why taste 12 profiles where only one change is made at a time when you can taste 3 profiles that are completely different? Good question. Yes, it takes an incredible amount of time and resources to conduct research in this way. When I've said I've pulled out my hair before, it's when I'd love to change 2 or 3 things at a time to see how it tastes, but I know I can't because I won't know which change made the difference in taste. To really learn how one change affects the quality of a roast, you need to change only one thing and keep the other variables the same or constant. It's basically enacting the scientific method. And I will say the challenge with roasting isn't necessarily changing the one variable, it's being able to keep the other variables the same and also knowing which variables those are that need to be kept constant. The other question that might be on your minds is, since I'm not doing the tasting, who will be doing the tasting? The tasting results you see will come largely from me and notes I've made over the past several years. In 2017, I received Q grader training and certification, which greatly accelerated my tasting abilities. Other tasting results will be feedback I've received from customers, baristas, roasters, Q graders, farmers, and even family and friends who say they don't know anything about coffee. Okay, very quickly, what are the key components that make up a profile? I want to briefly go over these since each will serve as either the variable we are trying to keep the same or the variable we are trying to change. Finish or end temperature is probably the most obvious and arguably key component that defines a profile. We could engage in profiling with finish temperature alone on both a large scale, light versus medium versus dark, or on a small scale, 405 degrees versus 408 degrees versus 411 degrees. When people think of a profile, they mostly think of the roast level, right? So yes, it is important and probably the most noticeable trait about a roast. But come on, we're experienced roasters here, and we know there's a whole roast curve that can be manipulated and experimented with as well. Case in point, today we're going to taste 12 profiles that have all ended at the same temperature of 415 degrees. First crack is probably what I heard about most when I first started as a roaster. People would ask, what is your first crack time? Or they would advise me to try and have a first crack time of 9 to 10 minutes. Advice like that can be helpful, but it's better to think of first crack in relation to your drying time and in relation to your development time. Moreover, I would say first crack is not so much about when, but how. And the how has to do with momentum. We'll be talking a lot about momentum as a big factor in roasting. But think about the speed or rate of rise at which you enter drying or enter Mayard or enter first crack. You can hit a 930 first crack, for instance, at 15 degrees rise per minute or 30 degrees rise per minute. Have you noticed how first crack can sound very different when your momentum is faster or slower? A faster momentum through first crack may sound a little louder and more robust and also be more condensed, whereas a slower momentum can sound softer and be more drawn out. Not to mention, both have pretty direct effects on your development time, reaching a finished temperature of 415 degrees in 2 minutes versus 1 minute. All will have an effect on the final cup. Yellow, or the visible sign that the drying phase is over. My biggest leaps and bounds as a roaster happened when I learned how great of an impact yellow times had on a roast. Over the past years, I've returned to the drying phase more times than any other phase to conduct experiments. And in terms of flavor development, I would argue it's the phase of the roast you should apply your focus to most. The two big reasons I advise you all to really pay attention to the drying phase is number one, turnaround, and number two, peak rate of rise. Turnaround temperature can have one of the most dramatic tasting effects on the coffee. Roasts can be improved doing both big moves and small moves. A lot of my work recently has been with turnaround, and I must admit, I've become a sort of turnaround snob. 100 seconds after I've started a roast, you might see me slump down in my chair out of frustration. It's because in those first 100 seconds, I've already determined the roast isn't going to plan, and I've anticipated to some degree what I will experience on my tongue. When we talk about the importance of controlling momentum through drying, we talk about peak rate of rise. Focusing on the peak rate of rise temperature instead of the yellowing time can add not only finesse to the roast, but it can be a more precise way to control momentum through drying. Because rate of rise and turnaround are so important, when we go to talk about slower versus faster drying, there will be two different taste experiments. One that's focused on higher versus lower rate of rise, and one that's focused on higher versus lower turnaround temperature. I want to give you all the full experience of drying. Let's jump into it and start talking about the first section or phase, Mayard, which, as you know, doesn't happen first in the roast. It's the middle phase. So why are we starting here? Because Mayard is where my roasting journey began. It's the phase where I started experimenting and learned how to improve my roasts. And because, like I said, we all love to talk about first crack. You see on the slide 3 different profiles. These 3 profiles represent shorter and longer Mayards, or the time span from yellow to first crack. Everything except the Mayard time span has been kept constant from profile to profile. So the turnaround temperature of 168 degrees, the yellow time of 6 minutes, 30 seconds, the peak rate of rise of 34 degrees, the development time of 1.5 minutes, and the end temperature of 415 degrees are all the same in each of these profiles. The one difference is when these coffees each reached first crack at 9:30, 10:30, and 11:30, after having yellowed at 6:30. Remember, the idea behind doing this is to be able to taste the change we make, so that when we taste differences between these 3 profiles, we know it's from the change in Mayard and not due to a different turnaround temperature or some other factor. For a short Mayard, I chose 3 minutes, which on any roaster really is pretty short. Even for a small sample, SCA sample roast guidelines stipulate a 4-minute Mayard. Whenever I do experiments and I'm changing something, I want to make sure that the difference I'm making is a big enough difference that I can taste it, which is why the next increment I chose is 4 minutes. Later on, once I start to see that I'm liking the way the coffee tastes in the 4 to 5 minute time range, I can do another set of experiments with 15 seconds or 30-second intervals. A big thing I recommend is when you do large-scale experiments, have 3 profiles to taste. I've done many experiments with just 2, and it works well too. But if you can do 3, you'll be able to more clearly taste a trend, whether it's intensifying acidity levels or waning body levels. So we sandwich the 4-minute Mayard with a long 5-minute Mayard. I'm calling 5 minutes long. 5 minutes is long in comparison to a 3-minute Mayard. Is it long in itself? It really depends on your roaster and other factors like your batch weight. I will say for a couple of my big batches, I come pretty close to 5 minutes, especially with naturals that crack at a higher temperature than washed coffees. A true long Mayard, I might say, is 6 or 7 minutes. Anything longer than that, and you're coming real close to stalling and baking, meaning your rate of rise is anywhere from 0 to 5 degrees. We're roasters, and we like curves. So here are the 3 profiles on the time temperature graph. They are color coded. The green curve is the 3-minute profile. The purple curve is the 4-minute profile. And the blue curve is the 5-minute profile. You can see where all of the curves line up and then where they deviate. All 3 curves are turning around at the same temperature of 168 degrees, and all are maintaining the same momentum through drying. After yellow or dry end, which happens on my roaster at 308 degrees, the curves begin to deviate and either go faster or slower through Mayard. First crack for all of the profiles happens at 392 degrees since they are a wash process. The same Costa Rica, by the way, was used for all 3 profiles. This line here indicates first crack at 392 degrees for wash coffees or 398 degrees for naturals. In each of the profiles, once the coffee begins to crack, it continues to develop for 1.5 minutes before reaching a finishing temperature of 415 degrees. So we have clearly set our profile goals and what we are striving to do. How do we do it? Please keep in mind as I talk about roasting details that temperature readings and fuel outputs can vary widely roaster to roaster. So you all know I conducted these roasts on my Dietrich IR12. As I mentioned before, they're all roasted with the same bean, a Costa Rica Cafe Vita, and I used a batch weight for each of 5 pounds. I set my charge temperature for these profiles with 168 degree turnaround in mind. 168 degrees is my standard turnaround for washed coffees. I could go a little higher or lower and it wouldn't make a huge difference. In my mind though, I don't want to go a lot higher or a lot lower. Other than batch weight, charge temperature has a pretty direct relationship to turnaround. If you are already maxing out the charge temperature on your roaster and you need to get a higher turnaround, then you should lower your batch weight to do so. Starting fuel will also have an impact on turnaround, but it can more directly be associated with peak rate of rise, meaning the higher the initial fuel output, the higher the rate of rise will peak. And the lower the initial fuel output, the lower the rate of rise will peak. So I set my starting fuel of 5% with the peak rate of rise goal of 34 degrees in mind. The combination of the 168 degree turnaround and the 34 degree peak rate of rise translates to a 630 yellow. Rate of rise generally peaks around 3.5 minutes. So around 3.5 minutes is where I start to make fuel changes to impact Mayard. My fuel changes will depend on the rate at which I want to go through Mayard. So for the 3-minute profile, my goal is to maintain a 28 degree rate of rise through Mayard. How did I decide on that number 28? Well, if you know what temperature your beans yellow and you know what temperature your beans crack, it's just simple math to figure out your rate of rise. For this coffee, I'm saying yellow happens at 308 degrees and first crack happens at 392 degrees. That's an incline of 84 degrees that the coffee needs to cover in a certain time span. Depending on what time span that is, just take 84 degrees and divide it by either 3, 4, or 5 to get your rate of rise goal through Mayard. So I'll do this math for you. For the end of the roast, keep in mind that the higher the rate of rise through Mayard, the sooner you'll need to lower your fuel before first crack. For all of the coffees, we're looking for a development time of 1.5 minutes, which translates to a 15-degree rate of rise through development. How did we get to 15? Well, from the start of first crack at 392 degrees to the end of the roast, at 415 degrees, that coffee needs to travel 23 degrees. So 23 degrees over, all right, my division sign is a little funky, over 1.5 minutes is about 15 degrees per minute. It's like 15.3. So again, the higher your rate of rise through Mayard, the sooner you'll need to lower your fuel so that it doesn't go too quickly through development. It may even be good to let that rate of rise in Mayard get closer to 30 degrees so that you can be closer to 20 as you enter into first crack. 20 should be okay going into first because washed coffees especially will lose momentum as they go through first crack. The rate of rise crash that kind of happens during first crack is the reason behind increasing instead of decreasing fuel prior to first crack for the 5-minute Mayard, right here. We're not necessarily looking to increase our rate of rise above 17 going into first crack. By increasing our fuel, we're just ensuring we don't lose too much or really any momentum as we go through development. So now the big question, how does all of this translate to tasting? Coffee for these experiments was either batch brewed or brewed in small amounts using a clever dripper. All tastings were done blind, meaning no one knew what profile they were tasting and giving feedback on. My guess is you all have done some Mayard experiments of your own, and these results shouldn't be anything too foreign. For this section in particular, every cup here was a pretty likable cup. There was a pretty equal spread of what everyone liked most. There were really no off flavors in any of these cups, just varying intensity levels of acidity, body, sweetness, and aftertaste. Those who liked more prominent acidic notes liked the 3-minute Mayard the best, even though it had less body and mouthfeel and less linger or aftertaste. This cup had a lot of flavor that popped. Light and delicate are words people use to describe this profile, and they reflect how the body is too in this cup. The acidity was a little more toned down in the 4-minute Mayard. Perhaps, the 4-minute Mayard here. Perhaps because the acidity didn't overwhelm the body as much, the body was able to come more alive in the 4-minute. More body and more balance in general meant more overall flavor. The words complex and robust were used to describe this coffee. The acidity begins to weaken in the 5-minute Mayard. The cup is still very solid. Without more acidic flavors though, the overall flavor of the coffee weakens a bit too. People who found acidity less desirable liked this cup because it was mellow and smooth. Here is Q grader, roaster and business owner, Michael, with commentary on the 3 and 4-minute Mayard.
In tasting the 3-minute Mayard, I found it to be a decent cup with a malic, a green apple acidity that was medium to on the higher side and a molasses sweetness to it. It was a little out of balance with the acidity, and in fact, as it cooled, the acidity definitely intensified. The aftertaste was quick and moderately pleasant. In the 4-minute Mayard, I found this to definitely be sweeter than the 3-minute Mayard with chocolate, an orange acidity and sweetness, and a light brown sugar. This was definitely a more balanced cup. It was a nice balanced cup. The aftertaste was medium linger, and it was definitely more pleasant.
An important thing to note is that by changing one thing or variable in a roast, like making first crack shorter or longer, it doesn't mean you're only affecting one thing with taste. As you can see with the diagrams, and as you heard from Michael, acidity, body, sweetness, flavor, and aftertaste are all affected even as you make only one change. It's because they're all intertwined. There is no increasing or decreasing acidity, body, or sweetness alone. Increasing or decreasing one often leads to an increase or decrease of another one. Regardless, in each section, I attempt to identify which is affected most: acidity, body, sweetness, or type of sweetness. For the Mayard phase, I have here that body is what is affected most. I mentioned that one of the first ways I improved my roast years ago is with the Mayard phase. I was doing really long Mayards and getting really good sweetness out of my roasts, but they tended to all taste similar, and it seemed like there was a lot more I could get out of them. As I started to experiment with shorter Mayards, the result was a greater mouthfeel and fullness of flavor, especially with the complexity of flavor. This was the case for both washed and natural coffees. Now keep in mind, you can't go too short with your Mayard or you'll start to lose that mouthfeel again, among other things like flavor, sweetness, and linger. You need to adjust based on your flavor preferences and your customers' flavor preferences. But in general, you'll want to find that sweet spot. The sweet spot will be a recurring theme in each section, especially because 3 minutes on your roaster can be different than 3 minutes on my roaster. This 3-4-5 experiment on my roaster might be a 2-3-4 or a 4-5-6 experiment on your roaster to find the same sweet spot. So please keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on to the next section, development, or the last phase of the roast. Usually in development, we deal with how light or dark we're making our coffee, and our development time is mostly dependent on the final temperature. The higher the temperature, the more time you need to get there, essentially. For this experiment, though, we have the same end temperature for all three profiles. The only difference between these three profiles is the amount of time spent getting to that end temperature from the start of first crack. So you can see the first crack time of 9:30 is the same for all three profiles. I've highlighted in yellow each of the different finish times, one happening 1 minute after first crack, one happening 2 minutes after first crack, and one happening 3 minutes after first crack. Again, I could do smaller intervals, but I just want to make sure the changes are drastic enough that I can taste them. Here are the three profiles as curves. Again, I've color-coded them in a similar manner as Mayard. The fastest development of 1 minute is the green curve. The slowest development of 3 minutes is the blue curve. And in the middle is the purple curve, representing the 2-minute development. For almost the entire roast, the three profiles are completely lined up, meaning they all turn around at the same point, they all yellow at the same point, and they all reach first crack at the same point. In terms of roasting these profiles, we can actually do an identical startup as Mayard. As long as we're still doing 5 pounds and using the same coffee, which is a Costa Rica Cafe Vita, we can use the same charge temperature of 405 degrees and the same starting fuel of 5%. Likewise, if we are looking to get a 3-minute Mayard, we can use the same fuel change that we used for our previous 3-minute Mayard roast. It's great when you already have data and you don't have to guess. But now we need to do some thinking again to figure out what fuel changes we need to make to get our desired development times. To get a 1-minute development time, we need to maintain a 23 degree per minute rate of rise through development. Here. 23 degrees is the number of degrees from the starter first crack at 392 to the final temperature of 415. I'll show you that math. So 415 minus 392 equals 23. Okay. Since our rate of rise going through Mayard is 28 degrees, we don't need to do too much to our fuel to make sure we're around 23 going through development. The roast will naturally lose a little momentum as it goes through first crack. To get a 2-minute development time, we need to split 23 degrees between 2 minutes and maintain an 11.5 degree per minute rate of rise through development. This right here. Having an 11.5 degree rate of rise through development in itself isn't too tricky. Coming down though from a 28 degree rate of rise in Mayard to an 11.5 degree rate of rise isn't so easy. The trick is being able to draw out development without drawing out Mayard. There's more than one way to accomplish this. After the peak rate of rise happens at 3 minutes 30 seconds, you can increase your fuel to be more on track for a 2.5 minute Mayard. Then, when you are a minute or so out from first crack, you can cut your fuel to the single digits. The fuel change will definitely impact first crack, but it's okay since the roast was already ahead of schedule, so to speak. Or you can do what I tend to do, which is try and make my fuel change as close to first crack as possible to really avoid influencing the first crack time. In doing this, as first crack starts, the rate of rise is still pretty high, but with a really low fuel output, it crashes pretty hard. As first crack is ending, the rate of rise will fall below 11.5 for 30 seconds or so. That's good since it has to balance out being over 11.5 for the first minute. Now, my strategy of making the fuel change close to first crack will not work for the 3-minute development profile. Even if I go to 0 fuel near or at the start of first crack, it will not be enough to draw out development to 3 minutes. A 7.5 degree per minute rate of rise is what is needed for a 3-minute development time. To accomplish this, fuel will definitely need to be decreased far in advance of first crack. It might be inevitable that Mayard is drawn out a bit too. All right, like Mayard, I would think development is another area where you all have done experiments of your own and can relate to some or all of the findings here. You may already know, for instance, that a fast development time can mean a lot more acidic notes. Since acidity is roasted out of coffee, not into coffee, it would make sense that by keeping the development time shorter, the citric acidity in the coffee, which is the first to get roasted out, would really be noticeable. For the 1-minute development, the acidic flavors are really what dominate the cup, much like the 3-minute Mayard profile, although probably even a little more so here. Also like the 3-minute Mayard, the cup tastes light, even though it is the same roast degree as the others. While the acidic notes are flavorful and vibrant, they are quick on the tongue. There is not much body or any real deeper flavor that lingers after the acidic notes are gone. The 2-minute development has the effect of a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is not as flashy as the beginning in the 1-minute development. The acidic notes are more malic. The entire cup tastes sweeter with the presence of a body that coats the middle of the tongue and leaves a nice milk chocolate linger. The 3-minute development is a cup that falls flat. The beginning is okay, but then there is a drop off in the sense that something is wrong or missing. There is virtually no pop of flavor with this cup, just a lot of blandness and notes that are muted and understated. Here is my colleague, authorized SCA trainer John, with commentary on the 1-minute development.
For the 1 minute development, it definitely had a lot of malic acidity, also some citric acidity, notes of apple and lemon. It had a pretty light body and the linger dissipated very quickly.
I want to emphasize that these tasting notes are for a washed light to medium roasted coffee. These would not be the same results for a coffee taken into second crack. This experiment of varying development times can and should be replicated for a dark roast. I will say that while the longer development time for a light to medium coffee is not preferable, a 3 to 3.5 minute development is what I tend to aim for with my dark roasts to get a really smooth, sweet cup with no trace of roastiness or bitterness. I would say that these tasting results ring pretty true for natural coffees too. Over the years, I've done a lot of work with naturals, particularly with regard to the development phase. Whereas I try and keep my light to medium washed coffees in the 1 to 1.5 minute development time range, for naturals, I tend to take them a bit longer to 1.5 to 2 minutes. There is definitely a trade-off, which always seems to be the case, right? While the acidity isn't quite so vibrant, you get not just sweetness, but a heavy sweetness and juicy fruitiness. I fluctuate between bringing out the acidity and naturals with a 1.5 minute development and bringing out the sweetness and heavy fruitiness with a 2-minute development. The 1.5 minute is probably best for a single origin roast. The 2 minutes makes an extremely good component in blends, especially for espresso. So we've covered the Mayard phase and the development phase. Let's now turn to the drying phase, the first part of the roast. I've split the drying phase up into 2 sections, turnaround and peak rate of rise. Since the drying phase can be half or even more than half of the total roast time, it seems appropriate to talk about it in 2 sections. Turnaround goes by a lot of names, the bottom out temperature and the point of equilibrium. It can seem rather insignificant and or be something you feel you don't have much control over. You get what you get kind of thing. If though you are paying attention to your yellow time, which I know a lot of you probably are, then you should also be paying attention to your turnaround temperature. The reason is you can get a 6-minute yellow with both a 160-degree turnaround and a 180-degree turnaround. You may think that those 2 roasts are going through drying at the same speed because they both reach yellow at 6 minutes, but one is actually going through drying a lot faster than the other one because it starts at a lower temperature. With my roasts, I got really comfortable having a yellowing goal that was the same for every coffee, no matter the batch weight or the temperature of the green beans. I really felt too that I had a good understanding of the drying phase and the importance of achieving a fast drying time to get sweet, flavorful roasts. And I guess you could say a yellow time goal as my drying goal was a good first step. I still pay attention to my yellow times, and they are great indicators of a fast or slow drying phase. But yellow times are not the way to achieve consistency, especially when you deal with increases and decreases in green bean temperature. To achieve the most consistency, the focus should not be on yellow times, but on the 2 variables that impact yellow time, turnaround and rate of rise. So you'll notice with these 3 profiles that the faster, shorter, and shortest drying time coincide with the higher, lower, and lowest turnaround temperature. The peak rate of rise is a factor that also impacts the drying time, but like the other variables, is controlled and kept at 34 degrees per minute. If the peak rate of rise, the Mayard time, and the development time are all the same in each profile, and the only thing different is the turnaround temperature, then the curves should look something like this. Just like with Mayard and development, the green curve is the fastest roast. The blue curve is the slowest roast, and the purple curve is in the middle. The turnaround time is the same for all of the profiles, happening around 1:40 or so for each of them. In terms of roasting, the biggest difference to note is the charge temperature, which, as I mentioned earlier, has a direct relationship to the turnaround temperature. And remember, all these roasts are done with the same coffee and the same batch weight of 5 pounds. So pretty simply, to get a higher turnaround temperature, you need to have a higher charge temperature. The tricky part with these roasts is controlling the peak rate of rise, which means doing the right amount of fuel in conjunction with the right charge temperature at the beginning of the roast. For the 176-degree turnaround, it took me 4 tries to get the 34 degree per minute peak rate of rise. 4 tries. 3 times I underestimated the amount of momentum that a high charge temperature alone, without any fuel, could have. In addition to starting with no fuel, this roast also required going to 50% air right at turnaround. I normally don't do the 50% air change until yellow. The 176-degree turnaround profile was very interesting to roast. I am not a fan of soaking, and I don't like the idea of pulling momentum away from a coffee during drying, whether it's by adding more airflow or taking out the dryer. But with this profile, it was the only way to slow down the roast from the turnaround point at 1:40 to the peak rate of rise point at 3:30. Once the peak rate of rise happens, fuel is added again to allow a little more, but not much, of a drop in rate of rise to get the 3-minute Mayard. To get a 166-degree turnaround, the charge temperature needed to be lessened by 30 degrees. Still, a 166-degree turnaround provided enough momentum that only 1% fuel was needed at the start of the roast. The starting fuel amount jumps way up as the charge temperature significantly drops again to get a 156-degree turnaround. Again, the hard part is not nailing the turnaround temperature. That's fairly easy to do. The hard part is nailing the turnaround temperature in conjunction with the 34 degree per minute peak rate of rise. The precise fuel amounts of 1% and 15% are to meet that goal of 34. Out of curiosity, I also did a roast of 146-degree turnaround. For that, I had to charge really low to 300 degrees and have a starting fuel of 40%. I'll talk a little about the taste results from that roast as well. With the turnaround taste results, my guess is we're starting to get into some new territory where you all haven't done quite as much experimentation. For this section and part of the roast, I'm saying that what is affected most is sweetness. By sweetness, I mean both how sweet the coffee tastes and also how pleasant the cup is in general. Of the 4 sections we talk about, I would say this is the only section where there is the risk of creating a truly unpleasant cup by specialty coffee standards. The reason, and I am referring to the 156-degree turnaround, is the lack of sweetness in the cup that results in often undesirable flavors. Now, I will say the general feedback on this cup is that it was okay. Being only 10 degrees from the 166-degree turnaround, the 156-degree turnaround had hints of the off flavors, but nothing super strong. I mentioned to you all, though, that I did a 4th roast of 146-degree turnaround. Now, that cup did have a strong, unbalanced character in which a pungent bitterness showed itself right away. This could and was interpreted by some as acidity, which is why the acidity level is where it is. In the middle of the tongue, where either a light or heavy sweetness would be tasted, there was nothing. It was empty. As the coffee started to dissipate, the linger that took over the back of the mouth tasted of rubber and pipe tobacco. On the other end of the spectrum, the 176-degree turnaround is a full tasting coffee with a lot of body and vibrancy. I sort of view this profile as I'm trying to squeeze out all of the flavor and sweetness I can, but I've squeezed it a little too much, and now it's a bit dry. I've learned, particularly with naturals, that you can't turn around too high or you will taste the dryness. It comes in the form of a graininess and chalkiness, even smokiness. By not squeezing the coffee too much, the result can be something more like the 166-degree turnaround, which, like the 176-degree turnaround, is very full and rich, but at the same time, very smooth, silky, and creamy. Here is my friend, farmer, Q grader, and owner of Paisa Coffee, Jolima, with commentary on the 156-degree turnaround.
I thought that the one that had the lowest turnaround of 156 was very subtle. It had kind of a flatter flavor or acidity. Also, it didn't have a lot of notes. Into my notes, I have that it had toasted seeds flavor, maybe like dried rice, but nothing too flavorful or juicy.
When I go to improve roasts, I usually make small adjustments that might include making turnaround a couple degrees higher or a few degrees lower. There's been 2 instances, though, in which I made a major adjustment to a coffee's turnaround temperature. One was turning around at 140 degrees and the other 150 degrees. I increased the turnaround temperature by about 20 degrees. And in both instances, I was surprised by how much that one change improved these 2 coffees by bringing out more flavor and sweetness. Unless you're already there and doing so, to improve your roasts, improve your turnaround temperature, it may mean having to down batch a little, so you'll have to decide whether to sacrifice batch weight for quality. I personally hate the idea of roasting less coffee at a time, and every year I resist doing so. But I end up doing it because I want great roasts. I go from doing 20 pounds in the winter to 15 pounds in the, or 20 pounds in the summer, sorry, to 15 pounds in the winter. The beans get a lot colder in the winter because the temperature in our roasting area isn't regulated. So maybe that will serve as some encouragement for you. And please remember, similar to how time spans can be different on your roaster, temperature readings can be very different. So my turnaround sweet spot will probably be a little different than your turnaround sweet spot. From this experiment though, you can still get an idea of when your turnaround might be too high and when your turnaround might be too low. All right, we're still in the drying phase, but now we're talking about peak rate of rise. With turnaround, we've set an initial tempo or momentum. Now we need to control the rate of that momentum as the coffee goes through drying. What does that mean exactly? Earlier, I talked about turnaround and how you can get a 6-minute yellow with both 160-degree turnaround and 180-degree turnaround, right? Right, you can, but do you want to? Do you want to make 6 minutes your yellow goal, no matter what temperature the coffee turns around? I faced this dilemma at one point. One of those roasts goes through drying quite a bit faster than the other. You think you have two profiles that are the same because they have the same yellow time. But really you have one profile with a peak rate of rise of 42 and one with a peak rate of rise of 35 degrees. When dealing with peak rate of rise, think of it as fine tuning and adding finesse to the roast. Because really, anyone can turn up the dial on the charge temperature and turn up the dial on the starting fuel. Let the roast go and not think about controlling it again until the end. The roast may come out fairly okay. Adding control in the first 3 to 4 minutes when the rate of rise is peaking can lead to a great roast with maximum flavor and supreme balance. Since a coffee's turnaround temperature can be one of the most unpredictable factors about a roast, instead of having a set yellow time in which your peak rate of rise varies, have a set peak rate of rise in which your yellow time varies. What you are seeing here is just that. Set turnaround temperatures, set peak rate of rises, and varied yellow times. Rather than being goals or targets, the yellow times act as indicators of a faster or slower drying. Now, these curves look pretty similar to the turnaround curves. With these though, it's like they've been pinched together at the turnaround point, resulting in a curve here that is really steep and a curve here that is much less steep. The really steep sloped curve that is going the fastest through drying has a peak rate of rise of 39 degrees per minute. The moderately sloped curve through drying has a peak rate of rise of 34 degrees per minute. And the least sloped curve that is going the slowest through drying has a peak rate of rise of 28 degrees per minute. As you can see, the peak rate of rise takes place around that 3.5 minute mark in the roast. Even though we are aiming for the same turnaround temperature with all three profiles, we need to do slightly different charge temperatures for each. The difference in charge temperatures is not as drastic as the turnaround experiment. The reason that they are different is because of the starting fuel amount. We touched on this a little with turnaround. No matter what the starting fuel is, it will affect the turnaround temperature. So when the starting fuel is high, such as 40% with a 39-degree rate of rise, we need to charge lower to compensate. For the 28-degree rate of rise, I started with 1% fuel to make sure I hit the 168-degree turnaround. Right at turnaround, I dropped the fuel to 0 and went to 50% airflow to pull as much momentum as I could until the coffee peaked at 28 degrees. Now, normally a rate of rise graph looks like a mirror image of the roast curve, where the steepest part is in the beginning and the shallowest part is near the end. So throughout the roast, you have a declining rate of rise. With the 28-degree rate of rise profile, since the roast peaks at 28 and then also maintains a 28-degree rate of rise through Mayard, the graph ends up being a flat horizontal line. It neither inclines nor declines. We could easily make this roast have a declining rate of rise by extending Mayard 1 to 2 minutes. I would not recommend that though, just for the sake of having a declining rate of rise. Personally, I think it's okay to have a flat rate of rise graph, assuming that the rate of rise is somewhere around 29 to 32 degrees per minute. Okay. Now, when I started to focus less on my yellow times and more on the peak rate of rise or rate of rise temperature, the goal I had for all of my roasts was 37 to 38 degrees. I loved how the coffees were coming out, super flavorful, super sweet, and very nuanced. I had a colleague though, who every time he tasted my roasts said, "It tastes dry." That was his feedback. It's dry. And it drove me a little crazy, but I can see now what he meant. Sometime last year, we were doing a routine roast of a washed Guatemala on auto, and it dipped way below the profile line. I told my assistant roaster to just set the roast aside and I'd taste it to see if it was still usable. Juicy was not a word I would have used to describe the washed coffee until tasting this washed Guatemala that had only reached a peak rate of rise of 34 degrees. Not only was it juicy, but the fruit notes tasted especially ripe and sweet. So in tasting the 39-degree rate of rise next to the 34-degree rate of rise, the dryness does become apparent. The 39-degree rate of rise is distinctively sweet, but it's a dry sweetness and a sharp sweetness. Because of the acidity level, there's also a dominant sourness and tartness. At a 28-degree peak rate of rise, a lack of developed flavor is noticeable. Similar to the 156-degree turnaround, the acidity in the cup is experienced more as bitterness. Papery and grassy were also words people used to describe this cup, particularly as it cooled. Here is Josiah, barista at Cafe Amouri, with commentary on the 34-degree rate of rise.
In 34, the first one, it's very fruity, but also very subtle, so it doesn't overpower everything. Has a good aftertaste, and as it cools down, the fruit really shows once it cools down even more. Overall, the best one here.
All right, here's another way to see the taste results of each section as they pertain to the SCA flavor wheel. I actually put together my tasting notes for all of the profiles before looking at the flavor wheel. In looking at the wheel, I was surprised by how much the notes I had for each section were already grouped together on the wheel. But please note, these associations are not scientific. I have assigned them based strictly on my own taste tests and experiments. Of course, you and others may have different findings. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you all with some advice. This might be the biggest one. Be bold and don't be afraid to find the edge. The edge is where you straddle the sweet spot in a cup that's less desirable. To find where the coffee is great, you've got to find where the coffee is not great. Then you'll know what to strive for and what to avoid. My growth as a roaster has come from being daring and pushing limits. When I first started roasting, I didn't know a single Diedrich roaster who was charging higher than 430 degrees. Since I needed to roast the biggest batch size I could, I started experimenting with a 435, then a 440, then a 445-degree charge. I got great results, and it was a game changer for my roasting capacity. When it comes to tasting roasts taste everything, including mistakes. Like me, with a 34-degree rate of rise, you may have a whoa moment and realize that a profile you were avoiding is really good. Get tasting feedback when you can, even if it's from the same 1 or 2 people. Tasting profiles can be a difficult, frustrating, and confusing process, especially when you know what you're looking for in the cup and then don't find it. Someone else may experience the coffee differently, and it also helps that they're removed from the process. Taste profiles using any brewing method, but have cupping protocol in mind, in which you purge the grinder first, pour water at the same time so the cups are the same temperature, and have the same amount of water to the gram in each cup. And remember, when you go to taste, hot coffee is the great equalizer. A lot of coffee tastes pretty good, if not great, when hot. It's when the coffee cools that the differences really become apparent. A great cup is good when it's hot and either stays the same or gets better as it cools. You hear this a lot as a roaster, take notes, but really, don't rely on your memory to keep straight 10 different profile variations of 15 different origins. I have pages and pages of tasting notes, most of them saying something like Guji 930 first versus 1030 first. 930, a lot more acidity, solid flavor, and some berry. 1030, less acidity, more body, probably more berry and heavier. Lastly, if anyone were to ask me, I'd say roasting is all about momentum and controlling that momentum. If you have control over momentum and the rate of rise, you don't need time goals. They don't translate well machine to machine, and it makes you not look at what you should be looking at, which is momentum. We are virtual today, and that makes giving and receiving business cards a little tricky. Here's my business card. Please contact me with questions and or inquiries about consulting. Email me or follow me on Instagram. I have a new Instagram account, Nicki Amouri Roasting. You can also, please check out these resources. Roast Magazine's Book of Roast is full of incredible information. It's been my source for all of the real chemistry and sciencey stuff. The Academy of Coffee Excellence has really great classes. Todd Arnett was my Q instructor and taught me so much about coffee. Paisa Coffee has amazing educational videos about farming, processing, and the economics of coffee trading. Also, my origin trip to the Paisa Coffee Farms was one of the best trips I've ever been on. Highly recommend it. Jolima and her family are awesome. Phew, this has been long but super fun, and it is so great to be in community with other roasters, even if it's virtually. Thank you, Connie, so much for this opportunity to be here and present today.
Nicki, that was amazing. The detail in your presentation, my mind is blown. I thought I could field the questions, and you lost me, girl. Way over my head. Thank you so much for putting so much work into that presentation and sharing it with the Roast Summit attendees. I'd like to introduce our next guest commentator, Miss Joey Gleason. Joey is an entrepreneur and coffee veteran based here in Portland, Oregon. She's the founder and co-owner of Marigold Coffee Wholesale Roastery. She's also co-owner and co-founder of Buckman Coffee Factory, a unique co-working space that provides rentable roasting equipment and workspace and facilities for people to create a great roasting community. Joey, hello.
Hi. Oh my gosh. Nicki, I loved that presentation so much. I just want to say one of the things that really stood out in that presentation is your roast curves only attacked one problem at a time, which is really difficult to do. But also you gave us a guidepost on how to get to those roast curves. So a lot of times somebody will throw up some curves, but they don't really describe how they got there. So that was really, really helpful.
Awesome. All right, let's get to some of these questions. Do you find that burner adjustments based on bean temp are more reliable than based on time? I think you covered that, but I'd like to dive into that a little bit more. especially as the machine accumulates heat energy throughout the day?
I'm gonna look at, Joey, please feel free to chime in. I'm gonna just look at that question again.
Sure. I can read it again too. Do
Yeah.
you find that burner adjustments based on bean temp are more reliable than based on time,
Hmm.
especially as the machine accumulates heat energy throughout the day?
I do. I rely heavily on bean temperature. So, and like I said, time I feel is sort of less significant, because it's just I don't know. I don't know. At least for me, I rely really heavily on the bean temperature, and especially that rate of rise, the rise per minute data on my roaster as well. Time though is, I mean, I don't want to discount it either. Time can be very important as well. So I don't know, Joey, what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that when you're looking at the rate of rise really helps, like it's a window into the future. So if you see big changes there that you weren't expecting, you know that you should adjust something even before you see it in your bean temperature. And I think that one of the things when you're roasting is you just have to like get a grasp on the future, and that rate of rise helps for me.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay. Next question. Do you think the more relevant data point is the turnaround time or the length of the drying phase? It's kind of related.
Now turnaround time, I know I didn't really cover that, because that seems to vary a little. I go more by turnaround temperature. That seems, so because turnaround time, I actually have the same turnaround time for, again, that coffee that turns around 160 degrees versus 180 degrees. It's about the same time. So I again, that bean temperature, yeah, related to that other question, it's the bean temperature for me. It's the turnaround temperature. But again, it does relate to the drying time. I rely more heavily on the turnaround temperature because it can mean different drying times based on the varied turnaround temperatures. If that makes sense.
I would also say it depends on your machine. That turnaround time is a lot of times is machine dependent or batch dependent, and it's really important for people to get a grasp on what they think is ideal by tasting it, rather than comparing, you know, I have this time, but somebody might have a totally different environment and they might enjoy coffee differently too. So I think going back to what Nicki said earlier is the times or the temperatures are relative to your machine. So, get a handle on your machine and what you like, and then adjust accordingly.
All right. Did the roast color vary in any of the experiments with the same temperature endpoint?
Great question. And I gotta admit, I didn't take the color of all of them. I do have a light tells that I use for some of my roasts. I really relied heavily on the bean temperature of the roaster. I didn't do very many color readings. So that is a great question. And next time I will probably, to be more precise, especially watching Rob's presentation, be using that color meter a little more. Yeah.
All right. Do you have any information regarding darker roasts, say 440 to 460 ending temp?
I mentioned it a little bit in the presentation. At least the development, I think, becomes more important. I would say for the whole rest of the roast, I almost do the exact same thing with for dark roasts as with light to medium roasts. I keep the beginning and the middle consistent for the dark roast. It's the end that you need to go kind of, so the longer development times for the dark roast seem to help it stay away from the bitter and roastiness flavors. So taking the development times darker or longer for dark roast, like the in between 3 to 4 minutes, at least for me. And a lot of my dark roasts in my roastery are naturals, which also seems, that's what they seem to like, is that longer development time.
There's a question about naturals too. Someone asked if you could explain what a natural is.
Natural process is when the coffee is processed with the cherry, the whole fruit is intact and laid out and put out to dry with the whole, the fruit still on it. It's instead of pulping it and taking off all the skin and layers of it, it's keeping it all intact with the fruit on it, on the seed.
Thank you. Nicki, when you refer to 6 yellow, can we interpret that as bright yellow to rule out all the other yellows?
I'm not sure I understand the 6 minute yellow.
6 minute, I think.
6 minute yellow. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I think it's from Chuck. So Chuck, if you want to put another add on to that in the Q&A, we can go back to that question. Any thoughts on cooling times and its flavor effects?
Oh, well, make sure you are cooling the coffee. I personally have not tested the effects of cooling on coffee. I think first, for you guys who are doing home roasting or, maybe even sample roasting, it's probably pretty important because the cooling mechanisms are a little different, maybe less powerful than the production machines. So, but super important, yes, because if you're not effectively cooling the coffee, that the roast degree is in danger of kind of increasing on you a little bit, or you get hot spots, in the batch when it falls. So it's very important.
Joey, do you
I
have
wanna
anything to add on cooling?
I don't have anything specific to add on cooling, although everything I've heard is cool as fast as possible. But I haven't run cooling experiments. But I just want to go back to the yellow color comment. The reason I kind of smiled was because I find that challenging also. It's kind of subjective when that yellow, what is that color? And I just try to go, I use smell as an indicator also. When finding.
Okay, so yeah, if it's about what is yellow, I guess yellow, at least to me, is it's the color, it's the color change, and it's when it turns. I'm marking yellow as that bright uniform yellow color. So right before it's like that, right before yellow green, or right after yellow green, right before it starts to tan a little bit, is, yeah. And I avoid taking out the trier. I sort of determined 308 degrees is the yellow mark for most of those green coffees. So since I know that, that's what I just say most of the, that's the yellow marker for me. So after doing it, I had found yellow after taking, doing trier tests and stuff when I first started on the Dietrich, but now I can just say it's 308 degrees,
I think that answers Chuck's question. This is a great question. It's really interesting to see someone promote a flat rate of rise over the widely accepted declining rate of rise. Could you speak more to your experience coming to this conclusion for your approach to roasting?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I don't know if I'm promoting it. I think I'm saying it's okay. I think I'm saying it could produce a fairly okay roast. It might be very dependent on your batch weight, but I'm not really promoting it. I mean, all of my roasts are pretty much declining rate of rise. I'm just saying based on that the curve in my presentation, and how if a 28 degree rate of rise, peak rate of rise is tasting good, and a 20-degree rate of rise through Mayard is tasting good, there's no reason why a flat rate of rise graph wouldn't be good, wouldn't taste good. You just have to experiment with it, but it's not something to avoid if it's tasting good.
I totally agree. I feel like just as coffee people in general, we sometimes, or roasters, we get hung up on like what the graph should look like. And I mean, people always say, taste before you look at the graph, because you don't want to think, okay, this is what this graph looks like, therefore it's going to taste a certain way. You want to taste first and then go back. And I think, yeah, you could have a coffee that tastes amazing, but it might not be what you expected it to look like on a graph.
Awesome. This comment, absolutely amazing presentation. My question is, have you tried these experiments with other coffees besides the Costa Rican, and were the results generally similar across all of them?
Great question, and absolutely. I just did, this was my experimental coffee for this particular presentation, but at my roastery, we have, as I mentioned, like 15 different origins, ranging from naturals to honeys to wash to anaerobics. And I do it for all of them. And I generally find fairly similar results. Not a whole lot of variation, although yes, with the turnaround temperature, and I think I mentioned that, or maybe I didn't, but I turn around a little higher for washed coffees and I turn around slightly lower for naturals, temperature-wise, turnaround temperature-wise. So slight variations, but I've definitely repeated these experiments over the last 8 or 9 years. So
I noticed that your list of certifications is amazing. Q grader, certified roaster, certified barista, authorized trainer. Someone's question is, what's something you can do to prepare before going to the Q grader training, sensory training, in order to make the most of it?
Taste as many coffees as you can. You really try and trip yourself up. I mean, Q includes a lot of different things, but practice your triangulation. I think Rob said that too. Practice light, your sensitivity to light, medium, dark roast levels. Test your sensory skills with aroma, smelling coffee, and just as many sensory aspects as you can. Get really good at tasting. But I mean, it's hard to prepare. It's a super hard test, and I've got to get recalibrated, and so I've got to hit the ground training again for it as well. So
How often do you have to do that?
every 3 years, although with COVID, we got some extensions. So
well, I guess that's one good thing. Kidding. I think we have one more. Do you vary airflow during your roast, or you keep it at one setting?
Oh yeah, I do vary airflow. So on the Diedrich, you have 3 airflow settings: 0, 50%, and 100%. I start with 0%. The yellow, I go to 50%, and about a minute and a half before first crack, I switch to 100% airflow. So I'm actually glad I only have 3 settings, because like on our Mill City sample roaster, you have like 10, and I think that would drive me crazy. So but yeah, I do the 3 airflow settings, and I'm consistent with it's the same for every roast when I do those airflow changes.
All right, I'm going to do one more. How long do you wait after roast to taste?
Oh, I love that question, because it's so hard to wait at all to taste a roast. So I've done it all. I've tasted roast literally like 10 minutes after it's come out. And I've grown this way. I do try and wait now at least a day to taste the roast, but I do find that it really peaks around day 3. The flavors are, they're pretty bright and acidic, and they're kind of, if you taste it too soon after roasting, it's not bad. You can still get a really good sense of the roast, but they kind of work independently of each other. Whereas if you wait a few days, they start to really meld together in harmony, and get a little sweeter and more, just they meld together. And so I do recommend waiting 3 days, although it's very hard.
I love
All
that.
right, any final thoughts? Joey, you want to comment on that?
Oh, I think it's so funny. Sometimes, we'll be so excited about something that we roasted. It's like, we have to try it. We have to try it, but you can't tell some of the differences till the next day.
Any final thoughts?
I just think that presentation, Nikki, was amazing. And I love how you put, do this specific thing to get this specific flavor, or these are what I've had. And I feel like you did so much experimental work to get there. And I just really appreciate it. I'm definitely going to dig back into those notes, and I thought that was a great presentation.
Thank you so much, Joey. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to meet you guys in person one day.
I know. Nicki and Joey, thank you so much for being part of the Roast Summit today. I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Connie.
guys. Thank you.